Basic Income Podcast. I'm Owen Poindexter.
And I'm Jim Pugh. As listeners to this podcast, you're aware that in the last couple of years, conversation around basic income has really surged. There's more interest and more discussion on the topic. People are starting to think more about what are the policy steps that might move us in that direction. But basic income is not a new concept in the U.S. We've talked a little bit about some of the efforts in the 60s and 70s to pass a negative income tax at that point. But even more recently than that, there's been a lot of foundational work that's been happening that's actually really set us up for the moment that we've entered in just the past couple of years.
So today we are joined by Carl Weiderquist. He's a professor of economics at University of Georgetown, Qatar, also the co-founder of the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network, or U.S. BIG, co-chair of Basic Income Earth Network, and the co-founder of Basic Income News. Welcome, Carl.
Good to be here.
So what first got you interested in the basic income?
Well, it's somewhat embarrassing to say, but when I was 15 years old, or right about the time of my 15th birthday, it was an episode of Milton Friedman's television show, Free to Choose, where he talked about one episode was entirely dedicated to a guaranteed income as a better approach to poverty. And he thought of this as sort of a part of an otherwise streamlining of the welfare system. And I didn't end up signing on with Milton Friedman's whole libertarian sort of ideology. But this idea, that was something, is that if you really want to help the poor, stop judging them, stop telling them what to do, respect them, and say everyone's needs need to be met. Everyone has a need for food, shelter, clothing, and a few other basic items. And they also need to decide how to get those in the kind of market economy that we should live in. We shouldn't be judging people. We should be helping everybody if you really care about a more equal and more just society.
Carl, you're one of the founders of US BIG, the United States Basic Income Guarantee Network, which was started back in 1999. Can you tell us what starting the organization was like and how it's developed over time?
Sure. After I became interested in basic income when I was 15 years old and a high school freshman, I had to go through high school, college, I worked for a few years, and so didn't do any work on it, and then went to graduate school. Didn't do any work on it for a long time while I was doing all the things. But when I was thinking about social justice, I was very much, my support for it became really central to my notion of what a just society means. And in 1996, Michael Lewis, Pam Donovan, and I were arguing about social justice. We were all graduate school students at the City University of New York, or just finishing. We were arguing about social justice, and we said, well, what is it we can agree on? What should be the next step to make this a much more just society? And the thing that we could agree on was basic income, or some form of guaranteed income. So we decided to write a paper on it. And Pam Donovan ended up doing other work and never really worked on basic income. But Michael Lewis and I have been working on basic income on and off ever since. And we co-wrote a paper then that was actually not published for years later, but we co-wrote it. And then I learned about, after writing about this and starting another paper on basic income, I learned about the Basic Income Earth Network that had been going on for 12 years, 10 or 12 years at this point. So in 1998, I attended my first European network conference, it was called at the time. And I wanted to join. They said, well, it's a European organization. What you really need is for people in other parts of the world to start similar organizations over there. So I went back, I talked to Michael Lewis and some people that I'd met in the basic income movement at the time, which were Charles Clark, Fred Block, Eric Olin Wright. And in December of 1999, we all met together and decided that it was a good time to start an organization. So I think it was 6 of us at that initial meeting at the Kiev Diner in New York City. We started the organization, and we started having weekly seminars in New York City, or monthly seminars, which weren't that well attended. But in 2002, we were able to have our first conference, and that was very well attended. That was about 150 people, and we found that actually there was a lot of latent support for basic income across the United States, but there had never been a forum for people to talk to each other. So US Big sort of created that forum. I don't know that US Big can take any credit for this big increase in discussion we've had over recent years, but that's how we got started. And it grew very gradually for the first 10 years. But then in the last 5 years or so, it's really been taking off. All around the country and in the United States, where some of the politics are so difficult for it.
So these days, a lot of people have heard of the basic income, and you can bring it up without raising too many eyebrows. Can you give us a sense of what it was like to be talking about this in the late 90s and early 2000s?
Oh yeah, it was, and I go back to the 80s, so it was really out of the mainstream. As the 80s and 90s wore on, fewer and fewer people knew what you were talking about when you brought it up. At least if you said guaranteed income in the early 80s, people might know it from the movement in the 60s and 70s. But as time wore on, fewer people were knowing about it. So you're interested in this idea, and it seems like fewer people are interested in it. And in the late 90s and the early 2000s, it seemed like it wasn't a movement. It was a policy, and there were people who were writing and talking about it, but it didn't feel like a movement because there was no following. And there were so few people involved. It seemed like everybody who was interested in basic income had written a book on it. There were that few people. And when you bring it up to outsiders, a lot of people would enter these things and says, well, that'll never happen, so we've got to do something else that's more friendly. And even inside the movement, it was different. It was very different than it is now. There was very little activism. There were activists, but most of the activists were writers. All they did was write because there weren't enough people to get out there on the streets and actually do activism. And many of the supporters were looking at what's something that moves sort of kind of in the direction of basic income to get people into this idea. What's a policy like that we could do? Whereas other people were just writing about basic income in the abstract and being very divorced from practical policy. And now that's all different. Now you have activists who are working for it, and you have people that are talking about moving to basic income directly, not these tiny little baby steps. And it's actually basic income, a full-on basic income, enough to live on, is what's really exciting people today, more than these little steps towards it, which we thought we had to do 10 or 20 years ago to make it politically palatable.
So any conversation particularly with someone who's not familiar with the idea of basic income, one of the first critiques that comes up is cost. What would be the price tag in providing everyone with a full basic income? Now, you recently published what you called back-of-the-envelope calculations on a basic income in the United States. And one distinction that you made sure to emphasize was the difference between the gross cost and the net cost of a basic income. Can you explain that distinction and why it's important?
Sure. First, I'll give you the bottom line. My back-of-the-envelope calculation for the United States is $539 billion a year, which is about a quarter of our total transfer spending, about 14% of the federal budget, and about 2.95% of GDP. So actually quite small, and I would expect that to be comparable in other countries. If you got another country that is about as rich as we are and about as unequal as we are, the cost should be, in terms of GDP, should be about the same. If you get a country that's a little more equal already, the cost will be lower. If you get a country that's a little less wealthy than the United States is, the cost will be higher. Now, people often think that it's way more expensive. I just saw Pavlina Chernova, who's often a good economist, make this same mistake that so many other people have made of grossly exaggerating the cost. She said it would cost 20% of GDP, which is more than 6 times what I'm estimating. What she's doing there, and the mistake, and the OECD made this mistake in a recent report, a lot of people have made this mistake, is that they think the cost of basic income is the amount of basic income times the population. If you do that for the model that I'm talking about, which is $12,000 per person per adult and $6,000 per children, that's going to be, I don't have the figure right in front of me, but something in the area of trillions of dollars. Let's see. I think it's over $3 trillion is what it was. Um, and that is an enormous exaggeration of how much it costs. That is not what it costs. And let me try to explain why it's different. Okay. It's because a universal program involves giving people money and taking back money at the same time, money to the same people at the same time. Now, some of it also involves giving money from people to other people. That's the real cost. And that's a targeted program only gives money to some, it takes from some, gives to another, but does not give back to the people that are contributing. And most of our programs right now are targeted. So let me try to explain the difference. In a targeted program, the government says to you, okay, we're going to take $1 out of your bank account and we're going to put in this other person's bank account. What's the cost of that? Well, obviously $1. You took $1 out of my bank account. I have $1 less than I used to have. That's the cost to me. Now, if the government then says, we're going to take $1 out of your bank account and give it right back to you, how much does that cost you? Well, actually nothing, because they can do that electronically. They take $1 out, they put it in, they take $1 out and call it taxes, put it back in and call it basic income. That costs you nothing. So the added cost of making it universal rather than target is no additional cost. Now, and that needs to be considered, because that person still has the same amount of dollars. All of those net contributors who are receiving basic income, paying for it, but also paying for it, they have the same amount of dollars that basic income that they paid for themselves. They also have those dollars. So if you want to tax those dollars and use it for something else, it's still there. Or you want it to leave it to that person to spend, it's still there for them. It is still there for other uses. So it is not a cost. The cost is how much do you take from the net contributors and how much do you give to the net recipients. That's the cost. That's the net redistributive effect. You got to take that and add. You got to take that and add the administrative cost to figure out what that is. So to find that amount, you've got to say, well, what is the rate at which we're going to tax this back? And I used a rate of 50% on $1, largely just because that was an easy one to calculate. And I got some data from this publicly available on the website of the Census Bureau. Got some data from then about income by increments of 5,000 and looked how a basic income of $12,000 for adult, $6,000 for a child, and a marginal tax rate of 50% would affect people in different amounts. The net redistributive effect, you find that the typical family, depending on family size, are going to be net recipients up to about $55,000. And the total amount that those people are going to get on net after receiving their basic income and paying their taxes, because they're paying a lot of their taxes themselves, the total amount that they are going to receive is of $535. And I figured if the administration cost is comparable, $535 billion, sorry. If it's comparable to Social Security, that'll be $539 billion total. So that is how much it costs. That's how much more in taxes the net payers have to pay in order to make this program a balanced budget program.
Yeah, that's striking how different that is from the standard people times money calculation.
Yeah, which is not meaningful. And every time you hear that, you have to tell people that is not meaningful, and that is easily 6 to 8 times the cost of an actual basic income. And you might be interested in some of my key findings from this report.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you about that. Why don't you say a bit more about those?
Okay, so with that method of calculating, I found out that this would reduce the official poverty rate from 13.5% to 0%. That's eliminating poverty for 43.1 million people, including 14.5 million children. Now, it's actually a little more than you need to eliminate poverty, because I was a little generous in saying instead of making it right at the poverty line, it made it about right at the poverty line for adults. This is with 2015 data. I made it a little more than you need to get a child out of poverty if they're living with an adult. And it's also for two adults living together, it gets them well above poverty. Also, the average net beneficiary of this UBI is a family of about 2 people. These averages always end up coming up with something like 3.1 people or 2.2 people or something. But we're talking about a family of about 2 people making about $27,000 a year total. The family's net benefit from the UBI would be nearly $9,000. After giving them the UBI and subtracting the taxes on their private income, they're better off by $9,000, raising their after-tax income to $36,000. So when you think of UBI, people are always saying, oh, this goes to those lazy rabble. Well, actually, no. The typical recipient is a family of 2 people with an income of $27,000 per year. That's the working poor. That's the people that everybody says they want to help. And it raises their income to $36,000 a year. So it is a very significant benefit for people, anyone really in the lower end of the income distribution. Also, I found if you want to lower the marginal tax rate to say 35%, that will increase the cost to $901 billion. And if you want to keep the marginal tax rate the same at 50%, but increase it, make it a more generous program, because the official poverty rate is actually rather low. A UBI of $20,000 per adult and $10,000 per child will cost $1.816 trillion per year. That's more expensive, but that's still less than 10% of GDP. That's also very doable. And I think that's what I really support. I mean, I would think the smaller one would be a step in the right direction, but a really generous UBI that people can live on and not fear that they ever have to even be close to poverty is what we need in this country.
So other than the net versus gross cost of basic income, can you talk about some of the common misconceptions that you've encountered over time when you see other people talking about or evaluating the idea of basic income policy?
That is definitely the biggest one. People thinking that it is far more costly than it actually is. Probably the second one is something that I hit on when I was talking before, that they think it is something for people who don't work. People get it whether or not they work. But with these more generous versions of the program, we're talking about net recipients being about half of the population or sometimes more. So this is something that is not about the poor. It is about everyone in the lower half of the working population, and it raises their pay directly by giving them a net subsidy after the taxes they pay and the basic income they receive. Another way that it helps the people even beyond that into the net recipient range is that it puts them in a better bargaining position. This is good for everyone who works for a living, everyone who needs to go and get a job, because they're now in the position where they don't have to take the job. They take the job if it has good pay and good working conditions and it's an environment they want to do. That gives people leverage to command a higher wage in the private market. So this could spread the benefits of this well up into the middle class, well up into professional workers who are net payers to this. Everyone who has to work for a living, this is good for. It's not about some dichotomy between workers and non-workers. UBI is quite the opposite. It's about putting everyone on equal footing while they enter the market, not putting the children of the rich in the point where they don't have to work and the children of the poor have to work for them.
So as someone who has spent a career studying and writing about the basic income, are there effects that you've come across or conclusions you've come across from studies that are not what one might expect?
Yes, there are actually quite a few in different studies. The negative income tax experiments that were done in the United States and Canada in the 1960s and 70s were widely misunderstood because people focused on just, well, how much did the poor work? Did we make those poor work as much as we do and everything? As if the poor are already working the right amount when they have to work 2 or 3 jobs to keep themselves afloat. That was the focus. But actually, you found out if you look at that extent is a side effect, whether what it affects on work. What you're trying to do with basic income is make people better off. And they found that people were better off in really important ways, that people were healthier, that you had low incidence of low birth weight babies. You had a decrease in infant mortality, that you had students performing better in schools, low-income students performing better in schools and staying in school longer. This something has been like the holy grail of education policy, because trying to affect really poor students with direct how they perform in education with direct education interventions turns out to be really hard. Can we give them more tutors? Can we give them more time in school? Can we give them an after-class program? It's really hard to get these things to work. But you find out the reason they're performing poorly is because their families are so poor. If you're not well fed, clothed, and housed, it's really hard to do well in school. Big surprise. But the negative income tax experiments showed that this worked. And in Canada, where they gave an entire town something like a basic income, a form of guaranteed income. When the entire town had it, they found that there was a decrease in spousal abuse and a decrease in people admitting psychiatric emergencies at the local hospital because the stress of poverty makes you insane. It is a big cause of poor mental health, and it's a big cause of aggression in our society. People whose needs aren't met tend to be more aggressive. Now, there have also been interesting results in experiments done in vastly different countries. Right now, there's an experiment getting started in Canada and one already underway in Finland. Those are fairly similar to the US, and we might expect some similar results. But there's also been studies in Namibia, in Uganda, and in India. And these have found some interesting results that in these countries, not only do you have positive effects on health and school attainment and those kind of things that we're trying to do, but you also get positive effects on work. You actually find that people work more after they have the basic income than less. Now, in a wealthier country, you're less likely to find that. And where our poor are not as desperately poor. And that's what was found in the US and Canada. However, in countries where people are really desperately poor, living on less than $1 a day, their constant struggle is, how do I eat today? And this makes it really hard to plan, well, what kind of job am I going to get in the long run? How am I going to build my skills? I'm too busy trying to find food for me and my family today to build my skills. But when they have something secure, they know that their family is going to be fed tonight, you find that they have time to build their skills. And you find that years on, that the people who receive the basic income are working more and getting paid more because they have this chance to build their skills.
That was Carl Weiderquist, professor of economics at the University of Georgetown, Qatar, on the Basic Income Podcast.
So I do think Carl's point about cost is really important here. Oftentimes when talking to people about basic income, the cost comes up early in the conversation and it can really shut it down. If people think that we're talking about doubling the size of our federal budget to pay for a basic income, they just see it as a complete non-starter. And having this clear and compelling explanation for how basic income, how the actual cost is really a fraction of that, it's going to make it so much easier to make that case to folks who are skeptical for that reason.
Right, and once you get that point through, that this isn't, like doubling the size of the federal budget, more or less, then when you start to think about the benefits, most obviously ending poverty in the United States, which is quite a nice benefit, but also those less intuitive ones that have come out of the studies in Canada and other places about, he mentioned domestic violence rates going down, education rates going up, that kind of things. It really starts to feel like a no-brainer at the net cost.
And we've mentioned this a couple times before, but I do think it's important to reiterate when talking about cost. I think whether you're talking about 500 billion or 3 trillion, people think, oh, like, do we have the money for that? And the answer is yes, unequivocally yes. If you look at the growth of our economy in recent decades, it has grown so much. We have so much more wealth. The money is there for this. There is the possibility of doing this at the federal level. It's just a question of political will.
Yeah, one thing I tell people is step one is just to decide that we want this. Like, we can, if we make it a priority, we can absolutely do it. It's just a matter of making that commitment. I also thought it was really insightful to hear sort of the history of basic income discussions in the U.S. and how people knew more about this in the 80s than in the 90s. And it makes sense because it was a policy discussion in the 70s, and that kind of faded out. And I bring that up just to make the point again that we should not take this moment for granted because, we're talking about this right now. In 10 years, we might have a basic income in the U.S. or it might be, back to the 90s. So, we really need to capitalize on the momentum we have right now.
Yeah, it's up to us to make sure this actually keeps going.
Yeah.
So, you've been listening to the Basic Income Podcast. Thank you to our producer, Eric Davison. And if you haven't already, please head over to Apple Podcasts or the podcast service of your choice and leave us a rating and review. And also, please do tell your friends. We aim to reach as many people as possible to get them to be hearing about and thinking about basic income. So if you know folks who might be interested, please do let them know. And we'll talk to you next week.